That's rather set me up, hasn't it? I don't quite know how I follow that. But to say thank you very much for coming here today. Thank you to Beasley, and thank you, Charles, for those kind words. A week or two ago, I was talking on the phone to an Algerian friend of mine in London who was saying, when are you next in town? We meet quite regularly and have a chat about things. And I said, well, I'm up sort of Thursday week. So he said, oh, what are you doing then? So I said, well, I've got a meeting. I'm giving a talk on Algeria. So he, politically tentacles out, oh, who to? Opposition, friend or foe sort of thing. So I said, oh, just a bunch of investors, potential investors, that sort of thing, very drab, and so forth. So he said, oh, God, he said, who on earth would want to invest in Algeria? Now. So we start off on that sort of doom and gloom point. And most of you who've probably been watching Algeria will notice it is a country of doom and gloom and malaise and, lots of bad news, etc., etc., etc. So to get rid of my prejudices, straight away, yes, there is lots of doom and gloom. I've been involved in Algeria since 1964 as a student. I did my PhD there, and I've been pretty much involved ever since. And so it's like part of the family, and like your family, it's a love-hate relationship. So, yes, Algeria drives me mad, it drives anyone who does business with it mad, we're all used to that. On the other hand, it is a great country, it's got great people in it, and if you can think hard enough, don't give me the answer now, which countries in the world have greater actual potential? The emphasis is on potential, will it ever get realised? So I'm going to finish up on that sort of, I think, very positive note, that it is a country with lots of problems, but it has got massive potential, and, we can move on from there. Okay, now I've just got to familiarise myself, put my specs on. There we are. That was what was written on the blurb that was, the invitation that was sent to you some time ago. The economy has been severely damaged by the post-2014 fall in oil prices. Contrary to the advice of the IMF, World Bank, etc., it's taken the option, rather of borrowing internationally, of printing money, which I emphasise the word could rather than will, could have disastrous consequences, but they may be averted. It's also got a major political crisis revolving around a political vacuum at the centre of power, which is namely the president, whether he will stay on in office or not, and a country that's really governed effectively by a sort of cabal of rather dodgy people around the president, his family, clients, an entourage which has a lot of self-interest, as we know, in these sort of things. So with an election coming up in 12 months' time, fraction less actually, probably the biggest question facing the country is who will succeed Bouteflika in 2019. The other questions, and these were laid out to you on the invitation, were what are the most and least likely political scenarios centering around that? What are the security risks facing the country from domestic social unrest and regional terrorism? What are the most and least likely scenarios for the economy, which is big talk this week for reasons we'll come on to, and the hydrocarbon sector? And finally, in this very uncertain, very unpredictable political and economic environment, what are the main opportunities and risks for foreign investors? So, to start off with the first question, who will succeed the presidency in 2019? I'll try and be quick on this because we could discuss it literally till the cows come home, and we probably will be almost right up until the day of the election. There is a widespread, the election has to be held before 17th of April next year, so probably sometime in March. There's widespread belief that President Abdelaziz Bouteflika will stand for a fifth term. Those of you who know Algeria well will know that he's a very ill man. He had a stroke some 6 years ago. He hasn't spoken to the Algerian public directly for 6 years. And his role in government is, no one really knows, but possibly fairly minimal. There is no official statement yet as to whether he will stand or not. That's important. There is nothing official whatsoever. Huge amount of speculation and rumour, but nothing has come from the horse's mouth. Only hints, with most of those hints actually being fairly ambiguous, but probably being interpreted by and large that he will stand for a fifth term. Against that, there are a lot of rumours, I emphasise purely rumours, that he will stand down. In the last couple of weeks in particular, there have been a string of rumours from Monde Afrique, mostly telegraphed through Algerie Patriotique. They would say that, wouldn't they? Algerie Politique is run by the sons of the old DRS boss, General Medien, and the son of Nezar, the former, his boss. So you've got two quite smart young guys, well, not so young now, running this information service, who, by and large, you would say would be fairly strongly opposed to the Bouteflika camp, on the grounds that the old division over much of the last decade in Algeria has been between the old DRS of Medien and the presidency under Bouteflika. Well, these are the sons of the old DRS, if you like, behind some of these rumours, so you take them with that spirit there. The rumours they have been putting out are that the family, that's Bouteflika family, are not happy with him standing for a fifth term. They're also talking about Medien, that's the old DRS boss who was dismissed in 2015, was the most powerful man in the country, without a shadow of doubt then, and before that. A gang of four consisting of Medien, Khalid Nazar, the old defence chief in the 1990s, during the Dirty War, as it was called, Mohamed Touati, the sort of eminence grise of the army at that time, and Issad Rebrab, the boss of Sevital. So you've got there the old defence security establishment with Rebrab, who is the richest individual entrepreneur in Algeria, probably in Africa, I believe, runs Sevital. Does this gang of four exist or not? Well, on paper, that would make quite logical sense. However, Nessar said, I don't even talk to Medien. Why should I? Good reason, because it was Medien who got rid of Nessar's right-hand man in 2004. Well, there's always infighting amongst the best of friends and so forth. So again, I emphasise a big rumour, but one which would make sense, if you like, in terms of recent history. And then the latest rumour is that push for Said Bouteflika, that's the younger brother of the president, immensely unpopular in the country and for various reasons. But again, the rumour that's been picked up was that General Tatag, Tatag is another very dodgy individual, was number 2 in the DRS. He was also the minder of the head of the GIA back in the 1990s, and was behind the Tiberine massacre, etc., etc., etc. So a pretty nasty, long, checkered record and so forth. Is now the presidential security advisor. He was running around the Emirates a week or two ago, ostensibly on security issues. The rumour was that he was touting around to see what support there was for Said Bouteflika. Well, all of those, I emphasise, are rumours, and they would all make some sort of sense within this very uncertain environment. What are the most likely political scenarios to come out of that? Okay, if I was a betting man, I would keep my money in my pocket. I think that's the best comment on that one. I've given a ranking because that's what people expect. If that turns out to be right, I would eat my hat, but this is probably the sentiment of the moment, which is that the most likely bet is probably that Bouteflika, assuming he stays alive, etc., will run for a 5th term. This probably won't be announced, assuming he's still alive, probably till the beginning of next year. I think this state we're in at the moment will continue. Rumour, speculation will carry on. I'd be surprised if it doesn't. If he dies, or if he does stand down, as those rumours might suggest, there's, I think, quite a strong likelihood that the clan around him will probably back his younger brother, Said Bouteflika, who is immensely unpopular. But popularity doesn't matter that much in the Algerian elections because they're so totally rigged anyhow. The vote of the people is, shunted off into dodgy votes. So it's really what the regime wants rather than what the people want. However, it does help if there's a bit of public legitimacy. And Said Bouteflika could have problems there. So at the moment, I would put him in as number 2. Number 3, Ahmed Ouyahia, the current Prime Minister. Well, I won't go into a biography of Ouyahia. Those of you who know Algeria will know him. Current Prime Minister, not the best friend of the presidency, but the presidency keeps enemies close at hand, so he's in as Prime Minister. He is an old DRS man, so we're into this division between the old DRS and the Bouteflika clan in Uyahia, and the rumours that I mentioned of the Gang of Four is that they would be pushing and promoting Uyahia. A lot of business seem to think he will be the next president. And the way the economy is moving at the moment, which we'll come on to, that is only good, I think, for his star, which may be rising slightly, or it might rise if this continues. Fourth sort of option is somewhere that the army steps in because of internal rifts. Rifts within the ruling party, social unrests, and it looks for some other sort of candidate, an unknown, as it has done in the past when it fished up Shadli Benjadid and then Zerouar himself. The army is a different beast today. It doesn't get quite so involved in politics, or it pretends not to. So I think this would need a fairly extreme situation would lead to that, but again, possible. Of the sort of other names in the mix, Mouloud Hamrouche is probably next. I was chatting to an Algerian friend and colleague just beforehand. She is more positive about Hamrouche than I am, but I think he probably is a viable candidate. The circumstances which I think might lead to him being put forward is if there was a degree of unrest, but not terribly serious, but enough that's just getting out of control a bit, the army would step back, watch what happens, put in Hamrouche on the grounds that he has a reputation for reform. He was a reformist in 1989, 1991, that sort of period. He's kept fairly quiet, and the Algerian people might well accept him on his reputation as a reformist. The army might say, well, let's see how that runs as a sort of stabilizing mechanism. So I think that's the argument for Hamrouche. Other names, Abdul Khami Hamel, Chief of Police, hasn't put too many feet wrong, really. He would be there. Moving down to some of the old names, Belaiz, I think unlikely. Qaid Salah, the head of the army, ghastly creature. In Washington emails, the most corrupt member of the army they've ever known, etc., etc., etc. A lot of problems around him. I can't really see Qaid Salah having much of a chance. Ali Ben Fleece, these sort of people, Ahmed Ben Batur, a good man, good economist, he said he wouldn't stand at all. Abdul Malik Salah, the former Prime Minister. These are all names in the mix. Frankly, I see them as yesterday's men and most unlikely. Possible but unlikely scenarios. Unrest in the army, particularly from the lower ranks. Just to explain this very briefly, I don't want to get too involved with it. National service, young men being sent off to barracks around the country, quite a lot of opposition to it, always has been, but increasingly so. There's a great deal of sexual exploitation going on here. Young men, might call them pretty boys, to use a horrible expression from Algeria, if they haven't got family connections or much clout, being siphoned out of the barracks off to paedophile businessmen in the area. They pay the army a whack, and this very nasty situation is quite widespread. There is total silence on it in Algeria, for obvious reasons. Any press that mentions it will be closed down. The only person, I think, who's ever published anything on it is myself, but I can sort of get away with it, I suppose. I get the evidence from these guys there is a mutinous situation going on there. The scale and size of it we don't know, but it leads to a lot of suicide in the army, a lot of unrest in the lower ranks, and it is very serious. So if that sympathy spreads up, it's already at the level of captains and majors. You only want a few colonels to start getting sympathetic towards this, and there are problems, particularly as the top of the army supports this. Qaid Salah himself has a reputation of inappropriate behaviour. There is very, very strong information, all the records have been destroyed, that he was actually dismissed from the army in the 1980s for inappropriate behaviour. He was a friend of Chadli's brother and was reinstated. The American WikiLeaks have him as the most corrupt man they've ever come across, etc., etc., etc. So this appalling situation is condoned at the very top. And this is a potentially very dangerous situation because it just needs some sort of trigger or some sort of middle-ranking officers to get in behind it, and the Algerian army could be quite a problem at the lower ranks. It's an unknown factor and one that I wouldn't rule out. Another possibility is widespread social unrest to the point where the army is forced to step in. I think this is unlikely. We've had sort of simmering unrest all through this year so far. It hasn't really got worse. It hasn't been coordinated. It doesn't look as if it's really going to get much worse. It might do. So I think this is less likely. I mean, and I won't go into the details why, but it is disjointed, it's disorganised. The security forces have very tight controls over these things. The regime is getting more oppressive in that sense. So I think that scenario where the army has to step in is possible, but unlikely. Some sort of crisis, broad sweep, followed by some sort of national convention. Opposition parties talk about this, but they're very weak. Again, I think this is unlikely. So there are all sorts of possible unknowns here, and those reasons behind them, but I less likely. Okay, what are the security risks? We've talked an awful lot about security in Algeria over the last 10, 15, 20 years and so forth. On the domestic front, labour unrest has been running pretty high through this year. The medics have been on strike for 6 months, longest strike ever in Algeria, still running. Teachers, it's spreading into some of the industrial sectors. But again, it doesn't look as if it's really going to take off much more than what it is now. It doesn't look as if it's going to be rapidly solved either. So I think we can see this sort of simmering on. I'd be surprised if it got a lot worse. It might. And it's not going to be resolved very quickly. Domestic terrorism, militancy, if you want to call it, again, this has been really very low for a long time, and I think this is a low-risk area. And those on the insurance side of things, again, I think this is I won't call it, I think a diminishing risk, really. There's been unrest in the extreme south in the last few months amongst the Tuareg. Again, this is very low. As someone who's spent most of their lives connected to the Tuareg, this is not going to blow up. I'd be very surprised if it is. The government's answer is, we've given them water and gas, what else do they want? Well, yeah, they put huge water pipelines down to Tamanrasset. They opened up a gas pipeline last month. To the benefit of the Tuareg? No. To create Tamanrasset as a hub in the south for industrial expansion, a big frontier town for Africa, etc., etc. So I do not see the Algerian Tuareg becoming more than a local talking point. So low risk. Civil disobedience, this new movement we're running for the last year called Insoumis, means sort of civil unrest. This is a blog being run. It's having quite an impact in the country at the moment. It's really directed at the national servicemen and so forth, and implicitly linked to the problems I was talking about at sexual exploitation, abuse of young men and so on and so forth, but generally anti-regime in general. Having an impact, civil unrest, again, is this going to shake the regime to the floor? Probably not, but again, it's another area which could flare up. It might link into problems with the army. It might link into civil unrest if it does increase, but again, relatively low risk. The army unrest I've just mentioned, this sort of mutinous strand in it. Watch this space, it may or may not happen. It's a big army, there's a lot of control in it, but it's simmering. As for regional terrorism, the risks of a run-over from Libya, really pretty low. The highest risk, I would see, is probably from Tunisia, again fairly low. This is returning IS people, Islamic State people, coming back into Tunisia and sort of relocating, into Algeria on the Tunisian border. I won't go into details here, but there's a lot of rather murky strands there with old DRS links into Tunisian terrorists, etc., and a lot of cross-border stuff, which is a bit murky to say the least. Again, that needs to be watched, but again, relatively low risk. The most interesting area, and I'm not going to talk about it now because we haven't got time, it's on the slides, the next 3 slides, you can see them, is what's going on in the Sahel. That's south of Algeria, particularly in Mali, where Algeria is up to its neck in dubious practices and blah, 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 rumours and heaven knows what else. And there's a big war going on in Mali and jihadism and so forth. This is going to become, and is already, a sort of major centre for proxy issues. Morocco, Algeria disputes, they're now being sort of argued out in the Sahel. So there's a lot of dirty washing being washed in the Sahel, if I can put it that way. Again, it's a very specialist area. Those of you investing in the country, keep an eye on it, particularly in the south. Get hold of our publications. We follow it in great detail in Mines's Sahara focus. So I think from a specialist point of view, that's the most interesting area, certainly academically. But again, it's not going to be a big security threat within Algeria. It's going to take up an awful lot of blah, 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 foreign relations and etc. With France and in particular, but not a big issue. So these following slides are really just explaining what I mean by that. They're there, and I won't talk about them more now. The general changing relationships with Bamako, the reasons for this, and so forth. So in general, security risks are, I think, diminishing right across the board. Having said that, there'll probably be a ghastly explosion or something tomorrow, but the trend has been moving in that direction. So for those of you in the insurance sector who are looking at this sort of area, that's the broad brush picture on that front. Okay, the economy and the hydrocarbon sector. The economy in general. Okay, we've got a rentier economy based on hydrocarbons. There's a misprint on the next line. I'll explain it to you. This rent, that's revenues from oil sector, 94-6% of exports over the last few years. In other words, the economy is totally dependent on hydrocarbons. The revenue, this figure should be, the revenue in the Bouteflika era, that's last since 1999, has been roughly $1 trillion, okay? So $1 trillion has come into the country from oil and gas. That is 96% of all its foreign earnings. The 300 there is the wrong way around. It's my fault. I put the minus sign in. It wasn't a dash, it was minus. Take away 300 billion, okay? So of that 1 trillion, that's 1,000 million, yeah. So from the trillion, take away 300 billion. That is the amount of money that's been nicked out of the system. I use the word nicked, you can use politer words for it, embezzlement, heaven knows what else. A very corrupt regime filtered out of the country into private properties, France, bank accounts elsewhere, etc., etc., etc. That is the amount of money that the regime itself has pocketed out of the national revenue. Oil price rising, you can get away with it. With the crisis of the last 4 years, it tends to show up. In fact, it doesn't show up because it's not mentioned anywhere on the balance sheet. And to get at this figure is virtually impossible. You work backwards. These are the revenues. These are the budgets. It's 300 billion gap. And this has been over-invoicing out of the country, siphoning stuff off into the Emirates, particularly into France, Switzerland, elsewhere, and so forth. The consequence of a rentier economy is there's no need to tax the population. The government doesn't need to tax the population. Therefore, there's no real justification for democracy. We, the government, look after you, so don't start bitching about democracy and all the rest of it, because then we look after you. And in a sense, the government has been able to take that line throughout much of the Bouteflika era, but not over the last 4 years. The fall in hydrocarbons revenue since 2014 has led to two things: budget and trade deficits, and therefore pressures on social transfers. That's all the subsidies, about 30% of the budget, which goes into subsidising basic foodstuffs, fuel, and heaven knows what else, as well as capital and operating budgets of the various ministries. Okay, the policies or strategies of the government towards this sort of economic financial crisis, which has been running for the last 4 years, and as I'll come on to, may be seeing the light of the end of the tunnel literally this week. First of all, has been to diversify the economy, get away from this rentier-based system. Okay, a vast amount of talk about this. Has much been done? No. You could argue, well, it's difficult to do much in an economic decline, but if we look at the various figures, trade figures, the shift into a more diversified economy over this 4-year period has been minimal so far. That's not to say the intention isn't there, but it's been more talk than action so far. Attempts to fix the domestic budget, various mechanisms have been tried, domestic bond issues, amnesty on tax amnesty, getting money back from the informal sector. All of those have been tried. They've all failed totally. The reason being is no one in Algeria would trust the government. Would you trust the Algerians with a bond? Of course you wouldn't. Would you trust them with an amnesty on tax? No, they'll just use an excuse to bang you up probably. I mean, Algerian people know their government. They're not going to go along with these ideas. And so they've all sunk before they even really floated. Increased taxes, yes, but this has been coming in now. What have I said here? Not really. There's not much clear evidence of much impact on this at the moment, but it's early days, and I don't think it will last. I think there's going to be relief coming through here in practice. External borrowing. This has been vetoed internally, contrary to the IMF and World Bank's advice. The reason why Algeria will not borrow externally, it means that if you're going to borrow from the IMF or elsewhere, they're going to have a good probe into your accounts. They'll find $300 billion missing, and we're into trouble. So the Algerian regime cannot allow the international institutes to lend, because they'll do due diligence and they'll dig up the biggest can of worms, which they know is there. And Yahya in particular has been adamant about this. One reason was that when they borrowed from the IMF in the 1990s, of course, most of that money went the wrong way internally and led to massive corruption in the 1990s. Yahya was in charge of that, and this is just something that cannot be allowed to be opened up. So hence, that's the logic of not going along with international advice. And the solution to get around that is unconventional financing, i.e. Print money, as has been happening. Third strategy is to reduce the trade deficit. The figures there, import bill, I'm just reading my own figures, in 2016, 46 odd billion. In 2017, a huge drop by almost nothing, down by $1 billion. In other words, it just hasn't been working. So this year, drastic action on the imports front, targeting to get it down to 30 billion. Will it reach it? I doubt it, but that's what the current problems are of this banning of many imports. That's involved a list of 851 products which can't be imported, a restricted list. That has caused absolute chaos because no one gave much thought to it. For example, a vast amount of food flavourings and these sort of things couldn't be brought in. Suddenly there's no food because there's flavouring in everything from ice cream to bread and so forth. So a rapid rethink over the chaos that's going on at the moment there. And as of this week, a new finance supplementary budget, the budget's being altered, a temporary budget's been brought in. This was mooted this week. It'll go before the Council of Ministers in about 2 weeks' time. It'll go to Parliament, which just rubber stamps what it's told to do in the autumn. I heard a rumour yesterday that Bouteflika had not agreed to this, but I don't think Bouteflika is in a position. This could be a rumour, I'm not sure. So there is a strong talk of a new budget coming in, but it's not rubber stamped yet. The trade deficit is now falling, the actual trade deficit, 2016, 17 billion, 2017 down to 11 or 12 billion. The exports, if you look at last year, the exports increased by nearly 16%, huge increase in exports, but again, this is the uptick in the oil price. Imports only fell by 2.4%. So again, the improvement here last year was purely on the oil price, nothing to do with diversification of the economy, and that's worrying. And again, the data on that, hydrocarbons, 95% of exports in 2017, what am I looking at here? The figures have got to look at the board. Hydrocarbons, from 28 up to 32. That's last year's increase in the oil price. So again, oil last year was beginning to save the country with only minimal contribution from non-hydrocarbon exports. So the diversification of the economy having no real impact as of yet. The latest data on that's up to this last month. Again, the trade deficit's falling sharply. If you take Q1 of this year, the trade deficit fell by a massive 83%. That's a huge fall from 2.9, so $3 billion this time last year, to 490 million this year. Exports are up, as you can see there, from 8.9 to 10.7. Imports are down, but only a little bit. So again, it's the hydrocarbon component, particularly the oil price increase this year. Again, contributing 94% of total exports. So we're still stuck in this rentier economy, but with the oil price going up, the trade deficit is beginning to look better. Again, the impact on forex reserves, which we're familiar with. Reserves have been financing this for much of the last 4 years, these deficit on the trade figures, particularly the stabilization fund, which is now empty. Reserves have dropped from forex reserves from 194 billion down to 114 billion, down to 97 billion at the moment. It looks as if they'll stabilize down around about the 90 billion mark. But a question mark here, of that 90 billion that are left, are they all accessible? Nobody really knows where they're invested, how they're tied up. Can they be released quickly? And there's a bit of a don't know on that one, because government figures are not transparent. Continuing with policies, fourth strategy, to reduce subsidies, roughly 30% of the budget. In the past, the state was rich enough to buy off civil unrest, as in 2011. It certainly can't do that at the moment. So targeting subsidies, or moving to targeted subsidies rather than across the board. A lot of talk about this, not much has been really done yet, and it won't really come into practice till about 2020. If the upswing on the oil front continues, I suspect that will just be binned, and not much change will take place there. So again, it's not yet impacting greatly. Fifth option has been unconventional financing, printing money. In November, when this came on stream last year, the Bank of Algeria created roughly $19 billion. That's a lot of money. It was pumped into the economy. The finance minister had forecast this would be only 4.95 billion. So from a forecast of nearly $5 billion, it increased to 19 billion. So a vast amount of money was printed in November, 4 times more than was forecast. There's a question of where that's gone. We'll come on to that. The sixth option is just to assume that the oil price is cyclical and will recover. This is the most dangerous option, of course, because it just means sitting on your hands and doing nothing and praying to God that the oil price will go up again, as it tends to do on a cyclical manner. Well, you probably know as much about that, more about that than I do. It may well be the case, but it's not the best argument to run an economy on. And as we shall talk about in a moment, there is a supplementary budget law, Loi de Finances, that came in last week, or it's not implemented yet, but it was announced last week. Where has this money gone? Well, first of all, there's immense lack of transparency. We just don't know. We have very little knowledge of where money goes inside Algeria. To give you some idea, how much has been spent on bailing out state companies? Well, a report in March revealed, this is from internal sources, that between 2010 and 2015, that's a 5-year period, $25 billion was spent on supporting 560 state-owned companies. That's an awful lot of money propping up just dinosaur companies. 4-point-something odd billion spent on just cancelling debts, 19 odd billion allegedly on rehabilitation of production facilities. No one really knows where that money has gone. None of it's been accounted for. It's raised by the Court of Auditors. The Court of Auditors are perpetually ignored. So just don't know. A list of some of the companies there that have taken up these funds. Politically, this, of course, is a problem because companies that live on state handouts employ more than 1 million workers. And with unemployment being what it is, high, this is a hot potato. So again, the question is how much of this new money is being injected into these companies? The answer is we don't know. I suspect it will be finding its way in there. If it is, of course, we're just staying back, where we were, the same old problems remain. Bank liquidity, there are interesting changes here. This increased 77% since November, that's when money was printed. If you look at the figures there, you see bank liquidity falling through 2014, 2015, right down to a seriously low level in 2016, and then bumping up by 68%, whatever it is, 77% in, I've got two figures there, 77% and 68%, that's for the end year or in November, so it's roughly the same. That's the printing of money. So it's gone into increasing bank liquidity, but again, how's that being used? The dangers of printing money, well, the IMF and the World Bank have been warning about inflation, coming out with vast amounts of data that every country that has ever done this has had disastrous consequences further down the line. So far in Algeria, Hermes has downgraded Algeria's credit insurance risk. Well, that goes with the patch, so to speak. Again, if we look at economic growth, 2016, 3.3%. If you're the UK, we'd be jumping up and down saying this is wonderful. In a country like Algeria, that is not good enough, not by a long shot. It was below what was forecast. 2017 down to 2%, again below what was forecast. For 2018, this year, the original IMF estimate was less than 1%. Then it said, revised that up to maybe a little less than 2%. While the finance ministry was estimating 4%, so this disconnect between Algeria's own forecasts and the world bodies. A new assessment, literally as of the last few weeks, the World Bank came out with a report saying, sticking to its guns, the country is heading for a financial crisis, but at the same time, both of them revising upwards slightly growth prospects for this year and so forth, but saying they're going to be pretty anemic come 2019-20. Reasons for this re-estimated growth, budget expansion process, i.e. printing money, this feeds into growth in a way of sorts, and again, maybe buying good news for the present, but with potential disastrous consequences further down the line. Doesn't mean to say they will be disastrous. It depends where the money is invested. I won't go into that. If it's going into productive stuff and infrastructure, it may not be that inflationary, but if it does, we're there. The price of this growth will be accelerated inflation, possibly. The figures there, again, Uyahia's figures, the internal figures, are much lower than the external sources. Well, they would say that because they've got these two arguments, and one's going to push inflation down, the other's going to push it up. Again, fiscal deficit forecasts, these look as if they are improving slightly. And this comes on to those of you who read stuff. We wrote last week, or the week before, this is just showing off, what we say on this. I said then, with the oil price at the end of April at nearly $75, it's slightly above that now, and averaging significantly higher than $70 since the beginning of 2018, questions are beginning to be asked about how this might impact on Algeria's financial situation. I said, even though Sonatrec's CEO, Al-Qadour, recently reckoned that $75 was a fair price for a barrel, a downturn cannot be ruled out. I mean, these movements in the price at the moment are very much dependent on global geopolitics, and they could yo-yo in either directions. Nevertheless, with the 2018 budget predicated on an oil price of $55, $60, it's not clear quite what they did predicate it on. The current price does provide some financial room for manoeuvre. That's what we said a week or so ago. A few days later, they come out with a supplementary budget, which I'd like to say is because they read what Mina said and they changed the budget. I don't think it was quite like that, but that's what's happened. Going back to last October, the finance minister said Algeria needed the oil price of 70, what did he say? $70 a barrel to balance the budget. So if that's what he said last year, does that mean that we're now going to be able to balance the budget? Because that's what the finance minister said in October. If we've got a price of 70, we can balance the budget. That's the question. The answer to that is an emphatic no, you can't. And the reason is that Ruahia was talking about the 2017 budget not the 2018 budget, okay? And the bottom line there is that the 2018 budget has been very expansionary, from 58 billion up to 74 billion. Budget deficit has increased from 10 to 18 billion. In other words, under the prevailing situation of 2018, you'd need an oil price of $100 a barrel to balance the budget. So what's the impact of printing money? Or what's the impact, rather, on printing money of this new, I think, upturn in the economy? I suspect it could be revised downwards. We might find in the next few months or the rest of this year that they will print less money than they were thinking of to start with. We'll have to wait and see. It's just a possibility. It would make sense. What will happen to the trade balance? Well, the trade balance in the first quarter of this year fell by 87%, as I just mentioned. If that's extrapolated out for the rest of the year, big if, at $70 a barrel, we'd have a trade balance of only about 2 billion. In other words, more or less resolved. So you can see what impact the present state of the oil price, if perpetuated, could have on the economy. It would also reduce the current deficit to better than the international forecasts. And lo and behold, after Minas sort of settled that a week or two ago, this week we have a supplementary budget. It is not definitely in place yet. Rumour that Bouteflika, I haven't heard this rumour myself, but Bouteflika didn't agree with it. I don't know where that's come from. It hasn't been to the Council of Ministers yet, and it goes there in 2 weeks' time or thereabouts. It then goes to Parliament, which will rubber stamp it one way or another in the autumn. So this is an expression of government thinking, I think, more than anything concrete at the moment. It introduced this supplementary budget, okay? It's an expansionary domestic budget, and it gives more protectionism. And it's also given 500 billion dinars, that's 4 billion plus billion dollars equivalent, into a number of ministries. The major beneficiaries in terms of ministries, that's not a big figure. 5 billion is not going to rock the boat too much, but it's significant, it's a move, it's an expansionary move. It's gone into, you might think that's extraordinary, youth and sports, what's that got to do with the economy? Health, what's that got to do with it? Foreign affairs, education and defence. Well, defence always gets its little bit. Education and health, these are strategic at the moment. This is where the unrest is. So these are basically moves to contain unrest. Similarly, youth and sport, there are big problems here in the stadia. This is where most of the unrest goes on during the day. So what we're looking at here is a budget that's handing out money to sort of control areas of unrest. I think that's significant. So they're not these virtuous, we're going to improve the health of the country, etc. This is to contain the unrest that's been going on in the hospitals. The actual allocations of that budget are not yet clear, but that's where they're moving to. They've introduced a heavy tax on importation, a provisional preventative surcharge of 60 to 200% on finished goods. This is presumably to get around having to modify the list of 851 items, which has been a bit of a chaotic mess. And quote from the government, we tell all countries that previously brought products to sell, come and make them in Algeria. So again, import substitution, invest, come and make the stuff in Algeria, will diversify the economy. A thing they've been saying for 4 years, but slow on the uptake. They're also going to increase tax on energy products. This is going to make industrialists pay the same for it and so forth. This is largely because most industrialists are state-owned. State-owned companies don't pay their money, so we're into this vicious circle. So it's an attempt, really, to try and increase that, and also to hit the middle classes a bit more with increasing cost of driving licenses, stamp duties, and so forth. So again, a slightly expansionary budget. Will it also lead to a reduction in printing money or not? We'll wait and see. The downside of all this, which is, you might say, is good news, the downside of this, I think, is very serious. And this is what we wrote a week or so ago. We said nearly 4 years have passed since the collapse in oil prices. During that period, virtually nothing, no major adjustment has been made, and they've just financed everything out of draining off the fiscal financial reserves while waiting for the oil price to rebound. That's the bottom line of the last 4 years. A lot of blah, 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 really hoping and praying to God we're into a cyclical trend on the oil price, that it will rebound, as it may appear to be doing at the moment. The results of the reforms implemented over the past 4 years have been meagre. Essentially, it comes down to a few announcements on subsidy reform, which is still really waiting to be launched in detail in about 2020. Trade figures show minimal diversification of the economy so far. And if the oil price remains at or above its current level, around $75, there's a very real danger, and this is the big problem facing the country, that the country's leaders will revert to the bad old days of simply relying on hydrocarbon rents and undo all the good work that might have been achieved through the reform policies had they been followed through. So the big risk is that the government will just say, oh, well, we're off the hook now, carry on as before. What are the most likely and least likely scenarios affecting the hydrocarbon sector? I've left the hydrocarbon sector to the end because of this huge overhang of the economy in general. Okay, first of all, these are just issues, if you like, within the hydrocarbon sector. Firstly, a decline in production may have been stabilized or reversed. Energy production continued its decline in 2017. There was an uptick in 2016. And the reason for the continued decline in 2017 was projects coming online late. Algeria is always massively late with projects. Those of you who know the country know that they take about twice as long as anywhere else. Well, the impact of that is, in these figures here. The envisaged return to growth in 2017, after several years, nearly a decade of falling production, after this slight increase in 2016, was down net in about 2% in 2017. So last year, 2017, was down a bit after the 2016 uptick. But the projections forward are more positive. So we could be now into a more bullish period of production growth. Secondly, new gas fields coming on stream, in particular Timimun, Regan, and the Tuat gas complex. And with these coming on stream now this year, they've opened. Sonatrach is forecasting a growth for this year, 2018, of 6.5%. Okay, that is a positive growth, and it looks as if they may be returning to a more bullish growth after the best part of a decade of decline. That is natural quantity of oil being produced, not the price, the quantity. The refinery capacity in the country is being increasing. Bitouni, the energy minister, has confirmed that this would be increased from the current 27 billion tonnes to 31 million, million, not billion tonnes, by the end of this year, and thanks to the rehabilitation and modernisation programme of some of the refineries, and also the plans to build 2 new refineries at Hassi Messaoud and Tiret. Hassi Messaoud's are online, scheduled to open in 2022. The Tiret refinery is following in its wake. Also, there's been flag waving or telegraphing for several months that Algeria is going to buy refineries overseas so it can refine its stuff abroad. It was confirmed yesterday, what everyone probably knew about. It's bought the Augusta refinery from Exxon in southeast Sicily. The amendment of the hydrocarbons laws, again, this has been promised for ages. It looks as if it's going ahead. Bitouni is talking about July this year. It'll be in draft form, basically to make life more attractive for foreign investors. Details are a little bit there, getting rid of red tape, dealing much more with companies at an individual level and doing deals with them at that individual level. So there's positive news there, finally, at last, we hope. This involves doing new deals with oil majors. Ulkadur has had a strategy of dealing with companies on a one-to-one basis, a lot of whom have had legal issues. He said, look, let's get all these legal issues out of the way. It's old baggage. Let's make a settlement. They've done that with Total, other companies. Let's move ahead and doing individual deals. And these are really, I think, very positive. And I've listed the main ones there: Total, Statoil, BP, Exxon, saying they wanted to come back into the country, etc. So again, ENI in particular, I think very positive noises coming out at this level. Some of you may represent those companies, and I hope you would agree with me there, that things are looking a bit brighter, on that front. Shale gas, the perennial, if you like, issue. Well, this was the subject of the National Conference on Gas and Oil in Oran last month. The focus was mostly on shale gas, a little bit cautious, fairly bullish, careful on the timeline, really talking around about a decade away, a lot of research to be done, etc. But positive noises there, again from the regulator, ALNAFT, and from the Energy Ministry. And my feeling is, in spite of all the internal resistance to this, which we noticed in 2015, the riots against it, it does look as if the government is going to move pretty strongly in this regard. Also, to link to that offshore prospects, it's looking much more clear on offshore exploration in the Mediterranean, and points there, a lot of this is moving ahead, surveys being done, contracts being signed, or provisional contracts, etc. And I think related to that, a very interesting development you may or may not have seen a few weeks ago, the declaration of an exclusive economic zone. So Algeria has followed France's principle of declaring half the Med going out from Algeria as an exclusive economic zone, which means everything and nothing, but I think it's a declaration of intent that it is going to follow through seriously on the offshore exploration. So again, looking forward positively. It's taken a very maximalist position. I don't think Spain will complain. It's not to do with fishing rights. It goes into the Spanish fishing area, but Algeria's not fishing there. And Spain gets most of its gas from Algeria, so I can't see Spain really bickering too much over that. In fact, it might even welcome it. As for renewables and other issues, well, there's been an awful lot of talk about renewables in Algeria, huge potential. My feeling is these are going to move more slowly than people might hope for. One reason for that is that the ministries have been split. So renewables now fall under the Environment Ministry, whereas oil and hydrocarbons fall under the Energy Ministry. So as we saw at the conference, the Energy Ministry is big, it dominates. And I think that politically, this kind of marginalizes renewables, politically at least, into a more junior ministry. Long-term renewals, contracts are up for renewal. They need to be looked at carefully. And the country is looking much more to Asia for LNG markets. They're maybe significant going forward. Risks and impediments, well, the risks, political instability, protectionism, which cuts both ways, of course, lack of clear leadership, decision-making, frustrating, corruption and opacity in state financial sectors, well, plough through it, it's a nightmare, lack of clarity on the investment laws, the 5149 is still hanging around, hostility inherent in much of the old guard towards foreigners, the underdevelopment of the banking sector, the financial sector in general, the insurance sector. Those of you in banking and insurance, I think there's huge possibilities here, but make sure you go in with at least 10 lawyers on either side of you. I mean, this is an area which needs development, but fraught with problems. Again, a difficult legal system in the country. Again, don't go in without good legal advice. And the danger of the regime reverting to what we mentioned before, just going back to where things were. Opportunities, phenomenal. Few countries in the world have greater potential. As I said at the beginning, if you look at these sectors, tourism, potentially the world's biggest tourism market. In practice, zilch. I mean, no one's going to Algeria. And the regime is not welcoming to this. The old guard doesn't want this, and it's not. But the potential is massive. Foodstuffs, agriculture, huge potentials. Medicine, I read this week, Algeria is the 5th biggest consumer of antibiotics in the world. I'm not sure of the source of that, but don't know where they're getting them from. Healthcare, mining, a big push into the mining sector, and minerals. So these are big, potentially expansive sectors with huge potential upside. In short, all import substitution industries are there. Again, on the public-private partnership, again, these are the state dinosaurs private sector funding going in there. This was mooted last December. It caused a political nightmare. Nothing much is going to happen until the next election. At that point, I think this whole sector has to open up or close down. One or the other can't do. So I think there's big prospects there, but they've been politically deferred. I just quote this from agriculture again. The government was saying this week, please come and invest in agriculture. The Supplementary Finance Act has provided opportunities, concessions to foreigners. I said Algeria has 8.5 million hectares of agricultural land, 3.1 are poor and not utilised, and of the rest, there's massive underutilisation in agriculture. This has been the strategy of the state ever since Boumediene. Oil, the big state companies, agriculture has been ignored. The country can't feed itself, and of course this now has fed through in the import figures and is part of the economic crisis. And they're now welcoming moves in this direction. So big scope in that area. And my final word would be is that I've tried to finish on a positive note. There is immense prospects in Algeria. They're just a question of how can they be realised. My advice would be those of you who are looking into the country, look at it. It has got this huge upside. One day it will be realised, heaven knows when. My advice would be do the research now if you're not doing so already. Rely on us for that, etc., etc. When you get more serious about moving in, make sure you've got an army of lawyers alongside you who know Algeria, you're familiar with the country, you know what you're dealing with, you know the downsides, the weaknesses, but also this huge potential upside. When would I do anything? I would be inclined to wait to know about the next election. It's not so long away, a few months, 9 months, 10, 11, next March. Wait and see what happens there. That could have big implications for the country. What would I predict now? I'm keeping my money in my pocket. I've given you the list of reasons. Very uncertain. The betting at the moment is on a Bouteflika fifth term, but don't put your money on it. Wait till then, see which way is the wind blowing, do the research now, keep in contact with people like us, Beasley, people who can help you on this before ploughing in. Vast fortunes are to be made, but also a lot of fingers could get burnt. It's one of those situations. Hope that's been helpful, and my time's up.